No heckling,
Heckling,
please.
that's right.
Especially from you at the back. Okay, so this is the talk on my journey of faith. Some people... start again. What calls us to God? For some people it's...
Don't look like, just go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry, I thought you were looking to make sure my head was in.
No, I didn't want to stare at you.
Okay, thank you. What calls us to God? For some people have always known God, and they grow up in a family where they've always known God. Other people hear the word and believe, so they go to church service or they go to hear someone speak and they know that that's truth and they're able to come into a relationship with God. Some people have a divine revelation and seek God out. And some people have a crisis in their life, and at that crisis point God comes through, and that was the case with me. It was crisis that pulled me to God. The sort of potted history is this, that in 2003 when I was married we moved house, and then in 2004 I gave birth to Gus, and also I changed how I was working at the time and left my work premises. And in 2005 I gave birth to Dexter, and then in 2006 I discovered that Carl was having an affair, and then in 2007 he left, and then in 2008 I was 40. So a lot happened in a very small period of time, and looking back now I'm very glad that I didn't know what those few years were going to bring, because it was a very, very full-on time. And in 2008, two things happened. One is that a little voice inside me that had been saying for quite a while, go to HTB, go to HTB, finally got loud enough for me to ring a friend who was going to HTB at the time, and for me to say, are you going to HTB, can I come? And the other thing that happened was that a book that had been sitting on my bedside table for the last previous 2 years, which my mum gave me, which was The Purpose-Driven Life, I picked it up and just read it every day for 40 days and just thought it was so amazing. And those two things really got me going on my journey of faith. And then when I was at HTB, Charlie Mackesy did his talk, the Bring Your Friends talk, which he does before Alpha each term. And in that talk that I heard, he said that Alpha was a really good brush up on the basics. And I thought, that's what I need really, a brush up on the basics. And so without really appreciating what Alpha was, I went on the course and never looked back since. And at the time, really, it wasn't a sense of failure that drew me to God. It was more this sort of sense of hope and of joy, and this sort of great delight in meeting a God who really was there. And Mummy had brought me up to know who God was, but I think at that stage in my adult life I knew that God existed, but I didn't know that he was alive, if you like, and I didn't know that Jesus was there and wanted to have this sort of intimate, daily, hourly relationship with me, and that's what Alpha helped introduce to me. The other thing about crisis is that when we run to God, he doesn't chastise us, he throws his loving arms around us and welcomes us home. And at the time, and really since then, the verse from Romans, therefore there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, really, really stood with me, because you know, at a time when my husband had left and I was in church, and church upholding those sort of values of married life, it was sort of quite odd to be there really. But knowing that there was no condemnation for me, and that God looks upon us in a different way, was very healing and very, very affirming. So the two things that I would say about my crisis were that, first of all, it brought encounter. It brought encounter with God in the same way that God in the Old Testament, he is encountered by people like he's encountered by Abraham and by Moses and by Jacob, and their reaction was sort of fear really, and they fall down on their face, or they fear because they might see the living God and die. But unfortunately that wasn't the same case with me. But that encounter with God still does make you realise that that moment of encounter is a very special moment in your life that can't be repeated. It's a very sort of personal part of your journey. And the other part that sort of goes with that is revelation. So when God reveals himself and all of a sudden you know that he's really there and he's really alive, that is such a sort of personal moment that can't be replicated. We all have to go through that moment for ourselves. That was really extraordinary to me. I didn't know that would happen as part of my faith journey. During the Alpha course, I also received the Holy Spirit, and after the Alpha weekend, went home and practiced speaking in tongues. Over the 10 weeks of the Alpha course, everything fell into place for me, and I knew that there was a God. I just hadn't known that Jesus was alive and couldn't wait to be in relationship with me. I just didn't know how, actually, that Jesus wanted... what's wrong? Being Spirit-filled did have its trickier moments. As part of the divorce process with Carl, I found myself in love with him all over again and was convinced that we would get back together again. And I can remember, do you remember we went to the Albert Hall that time? We went to see a ballet and we were in the ladies' loos, and I was so convinced that we were going to get back together. And you were so good, you took it so well, because you must have just thought, absolutely no way by that stage. But that's the sort of tricky thing about the Spirit, that because he just sort of pours out, his love into your heart, that it was just sort of pouring out of me. And I think Carl might have thought that I was slightly mad around that time, but I think one thing that it did do, although it was sort of quite a confusing time, was that it did, I know that there was a certain space of time where things could have been different, and that Carl had a choice to make. And he had a choice to be reconciled with his wife and to come back to his children, but he chose not to do that. And I can remember that I did put the divorce on hold for a little while, because I just felt that there was this period of time where I just wanted to wait and make sure. But he chose something different, and actually then God strengthened me to be able to deal with that. But it was quite funny, really, because I think the Spirit, just when he overflows your heart, he does just overflow your heart. There's not much you can do about it. So the children and I moved to Egham out of London, and I started to work for myself. I did exactly what I'd always done before. I made wedding dresses like I had made them before. I advertised in exactly the same places that I had previously advertised in, and the business completely bombed. It didn't even whimper, it just died. However, all this time I felt I was getting confirmation that I should continue creating, making, designing, yet nothing I did succeeded. It was a very hard time. I felt like a complete failure. In the world's eyes, maybe I was a complete failure, but rather than call this part of my life failure, I think I'd call it identity. When my work failed, I felt that my identity had gone. It's only now that I see that my identity was so closely wrapped up in my work that the only way for me to be free in Christ was to be rid of what was giving me, to a certain extent, a false identity. In not being able to cling to or hide behind my work, I had to stand alone before God and be able to offer him nothing except myself. Having read God Meant It for Good by Artie Kendall, which I highly recommend if you haven't read it, I can see now how God's hand has been on this part of my life, painful though it has been. And the verse that really sticks with me from this time is, humble yourself under the mighty hand of God, that in due time he may exalt you. Because to begin with, I was so resistant of that humbling, and now I just think it's the place where I'd most like to be, and that's absolutely fine, and that if in due time, of course, he does exalt me, then that's really great, but the humbling process is fine. Something that I did find confusing was that I used to sit in church and understand how evangelism is to God's glory, but not understand how making dresses to be to God's glory. Over the past couple of years, I have prayed about this a lot, as I know that in some way making dresses was just as important as running an Alpha small group. I just didn't know how. Now I do know. I know that God has uniquely gifted me, and I know that part of the plan and purpose of my life is for me to walk this gifting out. On the way, I am meant to expect trouble. Once I thought that this trouble or failure was a sign of lacking or something wrong in myself. Now I realise that we overcome adversity with God. We face this adversity and we overcome it, and that's how we grow. And before, when I was doing a run through of this talk, this is something that we talked about quite a bit, how we feel that when we come across trouble, that in some way that it's something that we have done that is our own failing, or something that we haven't done right, or something wrong in us. But we don't actually realise that these troubles are just to come along to test us, and that actually what we do is we walk them out with God, and as we do walk them out we grow stronger as a result of it, and then we're more able to deal with other things, but also to help other people to come through what we have done. And I can remember actually in Rick Warren's book he says the source of your greatest trial or your greatest disappointment will most probably be the source of your gifting or your ministry. And I can remember thinking, no, once I've got myself through this divorce, I am never ever coming back to this place again, and I'm never ever going to be able to help someone through it or want to help someone through it. And now I think, yes, absolutely, you know, if there is someone else who would need help, then I know that I would be strong enough to do it, and also to be able to say to them, you know, take heart and trust in God and just walk this time out with him and don't be afraid and just carry on going. Also, actually, to do with this gifting was this sense of fear, and I didn't really realise until I was sort of in this relationship with God how much fear was part of my everyday life, and to a certain extent that was a sort of fallout from the divorce and then having gone to court with Carl, and I was fearful of everything from, you know, post coming through the door, didn't like to answer the telephone, didn't like to get through my to-do list, everything. And I can remember realising that I could pray over myself for fear to go, and that this realisation that fear didn't need to stay in me. And that verse from Timothy where he says, we were not given a spirit of fear, but of power and love and self-control. I know some translations are slightly different. And I just prayed that over myself, and that was a couple of years ago now, and it's not been a sort of really direct path, but slowly, like some water on stone, God has got me to a point where not only have I been able to control the fear and reduce it, and to know what to do when fear comes my way, but now I'm able to, got to the stage where I can sort of step forward and say, yes, now I can do anything through Christ who strengthens me. But I had to get rid of that fear first. And what God has called me to do in getting rid of that fear is very small steps of obedience. So checking my bank account, keeping my house tidy, things that actually once upon a time I would have considered not necessarily that important. But it's those small steps of obedience that I've done that has kept the much bigger things at bay, the fear at bay, and actually really, really controlled it to the point where now I really look forward to stepping out, and also when I see problems arise, like the problem with the telephone bill and the rolling contract and everything, I can just take a stand and say, no, this doesn't happen, and we move on. And the final sort of little subject grouping as part of my journey of faith is what God has done with my family and also with my friends. And I had no idea how he was going to bring people around me and surround me with such lovely people, and that has been such an amazing blessing. Actually, one of the flip sides that's probably been quite hard is for my non-Christian friends, that has been quite a struggle to sort of maintain those relationships when at times I've not really wanted to. And when I first did Alpha, some people were quite critical and felt that I changed for the worst as a result of doing Alpha, and those relationships still continue to be quite tricky. But the relationships that God is putting around me of family and friends who are just really extraordinary and who are walking a similar walk to me has been amazing. And also how my relationship with Mummy has really blossomed, and also how I'm able to bring the children up to really know who God is. And I think that of everything, because one of the things that I think with Carl leaving that I was really indignant about was to be left with the children, because I felt, I know it sounds awful now saying it, but I almost felt it was like a life sentence, you know, not only had he left, but I was now going to just have to, you know, my life had ended effectively, and I was going to have to bring these children up, and I was quite indignant about it. But God really broke my heart for the boys, you know, really, really did. And now I just sort of think, even though they're two little pickles, that it's such a privilege to have them, and it's so amazing, and you know that I'm so lucky to have them. And you know, I said to Dexter this morning when we were getting up, what do you think is the best thing about God? And he just, you know, he's 8, and he just said, well, that he forgives us. And he said, what do you think, Mummy? And I said, that he loves us. And Dexter went, yes, and that he protects us and looks after us. And I think to be able to have that and to know that, I mean, that's just sort of so extraordinary, really. So, yes, that's it.
That's the best beginning you can give.
It is. It's so amazing. It's so amazing. I've just and you don't, a bit like when we were discussing earlier about